forward here real quick. It's wonderful to meet
Okay.
you. Thank you for taking a
Nice.
minute out.
Sure thing. Nice to meet you too. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. So before we get into your life, probably one of the things that um, a lot of people in their lives would love to do is to publish a book. You hold a lot of power. And I really, before we get into that, I want to know one of the things that really kind of turned everything upside down, probably inspired as much as it detracted, was COVID. How did you survive the pandemic, and how has it changed the way that you view life now and the way that you conduct business?
Life did not change much for me during the pandemic. I have worked at home as a remote worker for at least 20 years. So I was already set up in a home office and had no problems making that switch. My husband is a doctor, and so he was still working. And so our lives had less of a social interaction, but the day-to-day was not vastly different from what other people went through. We didn't have this huge shift. If anything, we were in Rome at the time, which is very chaotic. And in lockdown, it was so much easier for things to happen, aside from the initial lines at the grocery store. So work-wise, it was a great year for me. People were home and people were writing books. And I had a very busy year, and I had all the time to dedicate to working. So it was good for me. I think what's changed is that for the rest of the world, people have started writing more books, thinking more introspectively. I do a lot of work with people who are writing memoir. So the pandemic for other people caused them to say, wait a minute, let me think about what my life means. Oh, maybe I'd like to write about what my life means. And then they realize, I don't really know how to write a book. And so there's a chain reaction that happens there.
So speaking of geography, you just said Rome, and I was interviewing a jazz musician who's in Kansas City now from Italy, and he was like, when are you going to get back? And I was like, well, when I was in Rome, I did throw a coin in the Trevi Fountain. So I don't know, but I couldn't imagine living there. When I went there, I went to see a pen pal that I'd been writing in high school. So I was in Castle Ferentino, which is south of Florence. So I go down to Rome, and oh, it was amazing. What I mean, the way it is at night versus day. I heard a cell phone go off in the Colosseum, like the clashing of cultures, the modern and the antiquity. It's amazing there.
It's amazing. It's wonderful to visit. It is very stressful to live there.
Yeah.
And since my husband retired, we have shifted our life almost fully to a farm we have in southern Italy. And I go back to Rome as little as possible, to be honest.
So where are you at
So
now?
I am in a small town in southern Italy called
Wow.
Belvedere Marittimo.
Okay.
And it's, again, I work at home, so I can be anywhere. And it's fabulous here. It's the perfect place for someone with, a creative type of endeavor.
Yeah, for sure. My dad was from Brooklyn. He's full-blooded Italian, so I have half my ancestry from Shaka, Sicily. The other half is from Naples. So, and I've been through there twice. I was back actually in the back of a water taxi in Venice on the morning of 9/11, trying to figure out how I was going to get back to America.
Oh, wow. That's hard.
But
That's
but honestly, of all places in the world, that's where I would want to have been. I actually found my way to Vernazza, the poor man's Riviera over there, Cinque Terre.
hard.
And that was amazing. I mean, the world's just teetering on the edge, and I'm just like laying on my back in the Baltic, just taking in just everything above me. It was amazing. It was kind of like the silver linings of COVID. There was all these things, as bad as it was. All of us had personal narratives, and it just played into where were you? What were you doing? How did you try to take care of it? But I did see the world change pretty quick in that very brief time. I mean, I had a flight that was supposed to go straight from Paris back home, didn't exist. So I had to get to Gatwick and London, and it was like a Hemingway novel. I had to find a way back home. But anyway, but Italy at the end of the day is one of the best places on the planet I've ever been to.
It, like any place, it has its problems,
Sure.
but the beauty of it certainly compensates.
Absolutely.
You know,
So
I mean, I'm in a place where I look out one side of my house and there's the Mediterranean Sea, and I have the mountains behind me. I mean,
wow.
it is very idyllic.
Wow. Yeah, I would say so. So you're a book coach, but I want to get to the essence of what you do. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of third graders at a career day. One of the kids, okay, they're going to look up and say, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How do you answer them?
I get paid to read books all day.
And then they're going to be like, "How can I do that?" Well, there's going to be
Right.
probably a handful. So,
Yes. So I was, one of those kids who would have been like, sign me up. Um, a book coach is a mix of an editor, a cheerleader. I think one of the skills that I learned many, many years ago in corporate is of a meeting facilitator, because I'm facilitating conversations with people. And it's sometimes feels a little bit like being a therapist. I try not to cross that line because that's not who I am. But you're helping people sort out the ideas in their head and get them on the page. And I help them sound like the best version of themselves.
let's go back in your lineage here. Where were you born and raised, and how did these seeds get into you to love literature and to pursue this career path?
I grew up in a very tiny town in southern New Jersey. There were 450 people on the census report in the 70s. And I went to the bookmobile. The county library was probably half an hour away, but at the time that seemed like that was a day trip. So the bookmobile came once a week, and I would go and check out the books that I wanted to read. At the elementary and middle school had a library in the school, so I would go there. And where it started, I don't know. I was kind of an only child. My sister's much older than I am. So I think living in a small town, houses are spread far apart. How do you spend your time? I was either outside riding my bike or with a book in my hands. And somehow I just always knew I wanted to work with words, whatever that might have looked like, whether it was writing novels or some other kinds of books. When I was little, I thought, I want to be a magazine writer. I didn't know the word journalist. I wanted to be a magazine writer.
Sure.
And so that's where it started. And then I got into, it sort of fell into some jobs in high tech, which is sort of odd. But from there, went into magazine publishing at IDG, which is a publisher that published tech magazines. And that led to an opportunity to write For Dummies books for tech. And that's where I sort of learned how to write a book and be a collaborator. And often in my collaborations with other authors, if I look back, I was in a book coaching role. I was the one who knew the editorial side of things, and the co-author was often the subject expert. So that's kind of what I do now. I work mostly in nonfiction with people who are experts in their field and want to share their knowledge with the world, and I guide them through that process.
That's excellent. And you're doing something that's behind the scenes, probably a lot of people don't realize. I mean, we all see these books everywhere, and you don't understand. It's almost kind of like when you talk to someone about making a movie, how many people are at the end credits, how much goes into it, from financing to blood and sweat and tears and everything. It's like you're a part of this very important process, because manuscripts are rough. I mean, no matter how good you are, I imagine they're rough.
Writing a book is hard, and it's not about sitting in a tower waiting for the muse to come knock at your door. That
Yep.
doesn't happen.
Yeah.
We're all really busy. Our attention spans get shorter and shorter every day, which makes writing all the harder. I talked with a potential client a week ago, and he's like, how much time is it going to take me every week? I'm like, if you can dedicate 4 focused hours, like really focused, not getting up every 15 minutes to get a cup of coffee, or checking your email or messages, or going on social media, like really staying there concentrated and working, whatever that looks like. Probably better if it's, 4 or 5 days a week instead of 4 hours in one shot. But that's probably a good number for working on a book. And it is hard. And there's a whole team of people that make books happen. If you pick up any book and look at the acknowledgments, you know how many people have contributed to that work. And you're right, people don't know that. There's this sort of mystery about being an author, and it is not as romantic as people
Right.
think it is.
It's not a Meg Ryan rom-com for sure. You know, I did that, you know about that November writing month, the contest?
Sure.
Okay, so
Yes.
I've done that historically, and with the voice to text on the iPhone, it's really good. So I did one a few years ago. I have a 30-minute commute into work, and I did it every day and finally got to the point where I had something workable. It's not ideal because your thought coming out of the mouth is different from the way your brain cognitively will go to the keys, but it's at least something to mold it. And I found that to be awesome and therapeutic. And I always felt good, like at the end of a proverbial day or week or month, so to speak, where I was like, wow, I actually wrote a whole thing and I was just talking the whole time. It's weird,
Yes.
you know.
No, and you make an excellent point. It's small, consistent habits. Anyone who writes about habits will tell you that. Speaking is an excellent tool. I love, Seth Godin's line. He says, no one gets talker's block. People talk
Right.
about writer's block. No one gets talker's block. So what you
Yeah.
did is an excellent way to capture your ideas. And for the most part, people will say it's far easier to approach the page when there are already words on it.
Yeah.
So even if you don't speak the way that you might write, you've got something to work with.
I was,
And
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, my guess is as you went forward, you got better at speaking well.
Yeah, it like my brain started saying, let's get rid of all of these little like useless prepositions and things that just don't need to be in there and cut to the quick. Treat it like Twitter. Let's get to the marrow, let's get to the meat of it, and let's get in there. I always thought, because I've never really talked to anybody about doing this, someone that's an expert. I always thought that maybe I would get, yeah, I don't know if that's really the way to go. But it's kind of the difference between paper books and listening to it. If you're doing it and you're actively a part of this process, it's a valid part of it. And I don't know that it's being abated by technology. It's just being a human being and having these tools, because at the end of the day, it's an organic thought coming out of your mind that's getting transposed into an ink or something. And it's just got to have some kind of origin and way to move itself down the line.
Exactly.
So,
And it's in those sort of empty moments, driving, that you often have your best thoughts.
right. Right. I mean,
So you're capturing them.
look at James Corden and the empire he built with singing in the car. I mean, those things that we do in those very private moments that can become a part of, because personally too, with jazz radio, I'll listen to CDs still, which is just a weird thing to a lot of people because we don't do it anymore. But that's when like all of the floats, everything floats around. My cerebral thoughts are there. I'm just like, it's visceral. It's like bam, it makes sense. So writing makes sense as well. So but I'm curious, with you loving literature as much as you do, what was the first book that parted the proverbial curtain and you were like, I either want to write or I want to read everything I can read on the planet?
So two things come to mind. The first is my favorite book from childhood, which was this book called Come Over to My House, which is a storybook, a picture book about this boy who goes and visits different people in all the lands, and you see what the house looks like in each country. And I just loved that book. So that it was a very visceral, I still have a copy of it, a visceral reaction to images and words together. And in that book in particular, the fact that it talks about going to different lands, there was a certain sense of adventure and meeting all different kinds of people and seeing different places. And the other thing that the book that's been recurring to me recently was The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. I read Tolkien probably in middle school, and was just captivated by it. I mean, those are big tomes of books to get through, and yet, at that age, I didn't have the distractions that teenagers have today. I'm just, and it was just diving into a different world. And then I remember the first sort of serious nonfiction book I read was called Praying for Sheetrock. And I'm sorry to say, I don't remember the author.
Yeah.
And that kind of opened my eyes to how wonderful nonfiction is.
Yeah.
And truth is stranger than fiction, because
yes,
even with movies, doing this work for so long, I can see where a story is going when it's fiction. Nonfiction life has twists and turns that are so unexpected, and it's just like, well, what are you going to do? Like, where did that come from? And so that to me is just fascinating.
That's so well said, because I think about that with, like, for instance, now I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about Evel Knievel, and my dad ran into him and said he was just he was just not nice. But I've always been fascinated by what he created, kind of the pre-Jackass era. Like, that was the original Daredevil. So I'm watching this documentary, and what a well said statement there, where it's like, in fiction, I can watch a movie and be like, all right, I see where this is going. And it may not go exactly where it's going to go, but it's going to arc and hit things that we all are used to because it's Hollywood script writing. But when you deal with nonfiction, I have no idea what's going to happen to Evil. I have no idea what's going to happen in the story. It's all bits and pieces of something that we've heard of. But when you see a documentary or a nonfiction in this linear version, you just think about how absolutely interconnected and mysterious and magical this life is, because it really is. And you can't capture that with something that's canned like a fictional thing. It's wild. No. It's very wild.
But there's also another challenge when you're writing about real life, because we have millions of events every single day, month, year of our lives. Which pieces do you tell? Which pieces do you leave out?
Yep.
And how do you put them together to communicate them with emotion and to keep people involved and interested?
Yeah.
So I just think it's fascinating. I love
it. It is fascinating. So if you could go back in time, anyone alive or not here with us anymore, and interview an author or hang out with them, what author would you love to be around? This is the curveball here. This is the one where it's like,
oh my gosh.
We can come back to it. If you want to think about it, let's come back to it.
So I have to say, part of me, more than an author, I think of wanting to go back and talk to Maxwell Perkins, who was the editor for Hemingway and Fitzgerald and many other early century authors at Simon and Schuster. Just to in the literary world, he's just such a fascinating character. The influence that he had on how fiction changed, because he was working with novelists. So I'd love to sit down and talk to him about what that was like. What did he see that other people didn't?
Yeah.
Because nobody wanted to sign Hemingway, and he was like, yeah, I'll take you on. Tom Wolfe. It's like, okay, let's see what we can do with this. He was a visionary, and that's interesting.
I think about that in the realm of music. You'll get record producers that are just masterminds of hearing things that we don't hear, things they pick up, ways they refine things. And that happens a lot. I mean, I even think about, there was a studio that Nirvana went to in the very beginning, and they had to pay a lot of money and no one knew who they were. And they just, I can't remember. It's going to come to me later who was in there producing it, but it was really their genius that got the sound that they wanted. And that happens a lot. I mean, you go back to probably Fleetwood Mac and maybe early Stones albums, and even George Martin with the Beatles. I mean, what he was doing with the cacophony of classical and these weird elements. I know a lot of it was drug induced for a time there. In fact, my wife looked at me yesterday and was like, saying number 9, like, what do you think that was about? I said, that was John and Yoko on another planet. And there's a lot of those. But anyway, I didn't want to get off on the rails, but there's all these people behind the scenes that take talent and make that a mass consumable product.
Yes.
And it's fascinating how that works. So do you ever think, coming from New Jersey, you're living in Italy now, the path that you've been on, do you ever kind of lean back and think, wow, I've come a long way?
Every day.
Yeah. Cool. So
I I have a charmed life. I know that. I mean, I don't know why. Maybe I was naive, I think having grown up where I did, some of the things I did, I just didn't know any better. If I look back, maybe I shouldn't have done them, but it all worked out in the end.
So, of all of the things that you've done and accomplished in your life, what are you the proudest of?
The first thing that comes to mind are my grandkids.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like that's the they live with us every summer for 3 or 4 months, as soon as school is closed, and then when school opens again in September, and they know that they feel like they're at home here. I think that there's what's that song, I want a house with a crowded table.
Yep.
That's the thing that I'm most proud of, that I've got a place where people feel welcome.
So, let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into the 20-year-old version of yourself, and you could give that version of you a piece of advice based on the wisdom you've gained in your life, things you've achieved, things you've overcome. What would you tell that younger version?
Don't be so tied to material things. Like, rent the furnished apartment.
Right.
And and just dive in, like to have maybe done the things that I've done earlier. I don't know.
Yeah.
To have traveled more. I didn't really start traveling until I was probably my late 20s, early 30s. To have, I was so set on creating a home, and truly, it's like, why didn't I just get a furnished apartment? That would have made my life so much easier.
Yeah.
No.
I think about that sometimes as a homeowner. It's like, man alive, if I could just have something different, because there's so many things you got to worry about. So everyone out there has a perception of you. We all have pockets of people that exist in our lives that perceive us in a specific way. Family, friends, clients, colleagues. But ultimately, you're in control. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I'm a nurturer. So, but my approach is definitely tough love. So, I want to take care of everyone, but I also want them to be responsible. Like, I don't want to do it for them, but I will be a support.
Excellent. So if anyone out there wants to learn more about you, anything revolving around your services in your life, where can they go?
They can go to barbarajboyd.com, and if they sign up for my newsletter, they get a PDF about choosing the right idea to write for your first book. because most people have a lot of ideas and they don't quite know where to begin. And I send out a weekly newsletter that kind of talks about writing. Sometimes it's about word confusion, like choosing the right word, and sometimes it's about life in Italy. And it's just kind of what's going on that week for me.
Cool. This has been wonderful. Thank you for opening up. Send my best to the old country. I miss it. And best of luck with everything.
Thank you. Come back and visit. Let me know when you are in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. I certainly will.
And next time I want to know about your pen pal adventure. I had pen pals when I was a child.
What a lost art. Like, that thing does not exist anymore. Yeah. 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 We were just good friends, and we used to send clippings and audio tapes and all of this. And it was just like, I'm going to go over there, and I just want to see the country. Let's do it. So she had a family, they had a family owned business. It was a pizzeria. And I remember I had to learn out of like an old book, and I had a little like phrase book. They watched me one night. They had a big family dinner, and they sat down, and I opened the book up to find something, and they were like, "What is that?" And they grabbed that book. They all laughed until they were crying at how absolutely generic and silly it was. And then one night her dad was watching me. I could see him across the table, because when you eat there, it's all on courses. I don't think a lot of people, if you haven't been there, understand, but it's a real event. And he was watching me sit there eat my spaghetti, and he couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his silverware down, came over, and he was like, "Ashvete," and he grabbed it, and he just started rolling with the fork on the spoon. And he said, and he couldn't speak any English, but he just kept saying, "Look at me, look at this, do it." And he would not be able to eat until I did it the right way. And I will never forget that, So it was wonderful. It was such a, it was so frightening though, going over there the first time. Like, it was lira. I kept hearing stories about how you get ripped off as a tourist because you have such thousands of denominations to go through, the language. But it was one of the biggest growth periods of my life. I was probably in my early 20s, probably 22, 23, something like that. So anyway, it was wondrous.
Oh, wonderful. Well, so, I'm sure you'll be back.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the fountain.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely. So,
okay, well, thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure.
Absolutely. It certainly has. Take care. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.